Welcome to the Latin American Studies Program podcast series at Villanova University. My name is Raúl Diego Rivera Hernandez. I am an associate professor in the Spanish program at the Romance Languages and Literatures Department, and also the director of the Latin American Studies Program and one of the hosts of this Latin American Studies podcast series. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Alexandra Délano Alonso. Alexandra, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well, and I'm really excited to be part of the podcast series. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, let me read you a very short bio about Alexandra Délano Alonso. She's an associate professor and chair of global studies at the New School and the current holder of the Eugene Lang Professorship for Excellence in Teaching and Mentorship. Alexandra received her doctorate in international relations from the University of Oxford, and her research focuses on diaspora politics, the transnational relationships between states and migrants, migration in the Central America, Mexico-US corridor, sanctuary, and the politics of memory in relation to borders and violence. She's the author of Mexico and its Diaspora in the United States, 2011, From Here and There, 2018, and the most recent book, Brotes, 2021. She's co-founder and former co-director of the Solberg Institute on Migration. So today we're going to be speaking specifically about your work on the politics of memory in relation to violence and the war on drugs in Mexico. And let me start with a question that I think it's important for our audience to know about the work that you're doing. So one of the difficulties that I see when the kind of research that you're doing is speaking about memory in Mexico, because the country is immersed in a deep human rights crisis. In other words, we're still witnessing the human rights consequences of the ongoing war on drugs launched in 2006 by President Felipe Calderón. We speak about 83,000 disappeared. We speak about thousands of Central American migrants in transit that disappeared or are killed in their transit to the United States. We're speaking about a country where to be a journalist is one of the most difficult professions due to the levels of risks. We're speaking about a country that has a crisis on feminicides and obviously a crisis related to the forensics that we're facing right now with more than 30,000 people that are unidentified in the country. So having this context, having this present crisis, how do you approach this situation from a politics of memory perspective?
Thank you, Raúl. And I agree with you. It's such a challenging context, and the depth of the human crisis at all the levels that you mentioned is so dire that sometimes questions of memory seem to come to be secondary to the challenges that need to be addressed urgently and in the moment. But as we'll discuss today, they have become also a central part of the struggle and very deeply connected with demands for justice. But to start with a little bit of context, I just want to give the audience a little bit more details about what we're talking about. This situation has begun in the context of the so-called war against the drug cartels that was declared in 2006 by President Felipe Calderón. And basically what this strategy meant was having an enlarged military presence to directly confront drug cartels that control many areas of Mexico that have controlled it historically, but this was the first time that they were directly confronted in a more violent way. And this led to widespread violence, not just between the state and the drug cartels, but also among the drug cartels who face more pressure to control the territory and their routes for drug trade. The government's emphasis on a military strategy was opposed to other possibilities like legalization of drugs or a focus on corruption, addressing corruption or improving the justice system. And has been continued by the two presidents who followed Felipe Calderón, each from a different party. First, Enrique Peña Nieto from the PRI, and now Andrés Manuel López Obrador from Morena, a party of the left, which is something very significant, that despite transitions of power through different parties, the strategy of the war on drug cartels has continued, despite the fact that it has claimed an estimated 250,000 lives as a consequence of these violence, and has led to the enforced disappearance of more than 83,000 individuals, as you mentioned, in the span of 15 years. So in general, given this reality, right, and the fact that it is being faced on a daily basis, and where the need to address the direct violence and the many spaces in which it manifests seems the most urgent one, questions of memory and memorialization are not seen as central. And in context around the world, we usually see these questions emerge at the end of the violence, if there can ever be a so-called end to the violence, or the end of an event or a mass atrocity. They usually come after processes of transitional justice. And here in Mexico, these debates have not been very present, because it can be argued that we have never had a real process of transitional justice, despite regime changes and the beginning of a democratic period, whether you want to call it in 2000 or another moment in time. But memory and memorialization has become more and more part of the conversation, especially since 2011, when the Movimiento por la Paz con Justicia y Dignidad, or Movement for Peace and Justice, Peace with Justice and Dignity, led by Javier Sicilia, who is a poet whose son was killed as part of these events by members of a drug gang in Cuernavaca, Morelos. He organized and led a struggle and a mass mobilization to call for justice, but also in relation to that, to create spaces for communal mourning that could represent and mobilize society around the ongoing violence and its many victims. And part of this effort was because the many victims of this violence have been portrayed as collateral damage or as criminals who were probably involved in some kind of criminal activity and therefore deserved what happened to them in some way. So the call for memorialization was also a way to reshape the narrative and to bring back dignity to these victims, to say their names, to recognize their families, and to begin to pressure the government against this logic that the strategy on the war on drugs was justified, and that whatever the consequences were, they were part of what was being addressed in the first place. So here, if other scholars like Maria de Becky Gurley have argued that questions of memory and public space have not been at the center of public debates and previous activism around these questions, whether in the 1968 or in the aftermath of the Dirty War in the 1970s, there has been a lot of censorship and suppression by the state. In part because, as we said, this transition to democracy did not really lead to any deep structural change. There's no framework of transitional justice. And there's no defined beginning or ending point to the moments of violence that we're talking about. The violence is widespread and it manifests in many ways, not just around the drug cartels, but also structural violences present in Mexico. So here we're seeing an emergence of memory debates in a context of different forms of violence, different high levels of impunity resulting from corruption and an ineffective criminal justice system, in which victims and families are presumed guilty and often mistreated by the authorities. So at the core of the discussion is not just when the moment to memorialize has to occur, but how and for what purpose can spaces of memory be created as part of the movement to address the violence in the first place.
What you have just said, you have used the concept of memory activism. That is an important framework, theoretical framework that you have been developing with your colleague Benjamin Nienas in some works. Could you please elaborate on this concept of memory activism?
So memory activism is a concept that we take from the work of Yifat Gutman and Jenny Wustenberg and others who have worked on questions about public memory and how the battle for public memory has more and more become a battle that a struggle that occurs from below, not just as something driven by elites and by the state, but that also involves a wider set of actors. So they talk about grassroots activists who are more and more around the world initiating the erection or the destruction of a memorial, unearthing stories of victims of extreme violence, or calling for official histories to be rewritten. And this includes individuals and associations of civil society activists, victims, political prisoners, families of the disappeared, veterans, and others who play a central role in bringing about change in the narratives and the ways in which societies debate and remember the past. So the struggle for memory, who tells the story, how the story is told, and where it's told, is opened up. It's no longer situated in one unique space and led by one institution or by the state. So they shape public discourse, and in that shaping public discourse, they're also shifting norms about the rule of law, impunity, public and individual responsibility, democratic governance. So the key question driving this focus on memory activism are under what conditions memory from below is also a vehicle for political transformation, and what are the implications of processes that are more open in terms of who participates in shaping public memory. And part of the question is, or the debate is, that memory activism doesn't just encapsulate progressive causes, that it can also encompass initiatives that challenge democratic and egalitarian values, and questions of memory that may have been settled in a particular way in assigning responsibility and accountability and challenging some of those spaces. So this focus on a multiplicity of actors shaping narratives, actions, normative frameworks, and spaces of memory asks us to investigate more deeply and compare the different motivations, beliefs, strategies of activists and non-state actors from across the political spectrum, and to think about memory in different spaces, not just traditional monuments or memorials, but also through art, testimony, archive, mapping, exhumations, reenactments, performances, and also thinking about more and more digital memory, digital practices, including hashtags, apps, and websites, and what it means to expand the range of what we call spaces of memory and who participates in shaping those memories.
So we're somehow used to hear about the different tension between the relatives of the victims of the disappeared, in the case of Mexico, with the state, different politics and initiatives, if they have some of them, to remember those missing loved ones, or to do some kind of politics of memory regarding people that have been assassinated in the context that you have just described. But I'm wondering, within this group of people that are involved in this memory activism, you have spoken about the family members of the disappeared, you have spoken about grassroots activists, you have mentioned political prisoners, etc. Like, what kind of internal debates can you perceive within these groups that are trying to develop this kind of public memory from the very bottom?
Thank you. Yes, that is a really great question, because as we know, memory, the narratives about memory are never settled, and the spaces of memory are always in transformation, and that's part of their purpose. And so I think one of the things to acknowledge here, thinking about within the framework of memory activism, that there are multiple actors involved, and that their goals and their focus and their understanding of the role of memory is very different. So in the context of Mexico, especially because there isn't really a public debate about what memory is and the purposes that it serves, it's not very widespread. The questions of what memory is, when, where, who, and how to remember, who are the victims, who are the perpetrators, can they be acknowledged side by side? All of these questions are very much alive in tension, and the answers are deeply contested. So some activists and organizations, including families, see the call for spaces for mourning and collective memory as central, as I just mentioned in the example of the Javier Sicilian, the movement for peace with justice and dignity. They see that as part of the struggle to call for state responsibility along demands for justice and reparations. They see spaces of memory and occupying space in that way as part of creating pressure for the state to respond. They see it as a struggle that requires the participation of the state and are willing to be in dialogue with the state in creating such spaces. And that an example of that is a memorial that was created in Mexico City, in Polanco, at the end of the Felipe Calderón administration, to recognize the victims of violence. But it's a space that's deeply contested precisely because many other activists see the space as something that legitimizes the state, that creates a sense of a moment of closure where the state accepted its responsibility and that's the end of it. So other activists say, let's not even acknowledge this space that the state created and take our struggle elsewhere. And some examples of that are the News Divine Memorial, for example, that commemorates the loss of lives of youth that were suffocated in a raid that was conducted by the police, also in the context of the war on drugs. And this memorial tries to strike a balance between being outside of the state and being shaped by the families of the victims, but at the same time negotiating with the state so that the state makes available some of its resources so that the space can become alive, but centering the idea that for the state to be really a memorial that serves the interests of those affected, it has to be appropriated by the community and not shaped by the state. So there is this tension of how to work with and without the state. And then other activists have taken these efforts completely outside the state and just refusing any space of collaboration with the state, a state that cannot be trusted and that other forms of justice need to be sought outside of it, and mostly through occupation of public space, the anti-monumentos or counter monuments that are put out on the streets without any permits being acquired from the state, and just a call for justice around particular events. Others that have renamed streets, have taken down the names of dictators and others, and just put a new name on a street commemorating an attack against a community or the loss of a life of a particular community member. They've reclaimed and renamed public plazas like the Plaza de los Desaparecidos in Monterrey, and of course also the widespread use of graffiti, for example, to commemorate and call for justice. And finally, there's families of the victims that say, that reject completely the framework of memory in this moment and say, the call for memory right now, there is no time for that. And if we call for memory, for memorializing, the state will just use that, and even our communities around us, to say, there is closure. This event has ended, and here's our space for mourning and memory, and let's move on. Seeing it mostly in the sense of memory as just reflecting on the past, rather than something that generates questions about the present and shapes the future. So, for some, there is still a sense that memory will be more about putting things aside and not acknowledging that the processes of seeking justice need to continue, and the fact that the violence continues.
Within these spaces of mourning and commemoration in Mexico, you have also mentioned transformative memorial interventions occurring in these specific spaces. Can you give us one or two examples? You describe the News Divine as one of the examples of your research, but I'm wondering if you can talk about these transformative memorial interventions happening within those places.
Mm-hmm. In general, a way to identify the sense of a memorial as a transformative intervention is the idea that the space tries to go beyond just the recognition of an event or the recognition of victims, but that try to address what caused them in the first place, and not just by naming it, not just providing information about it, but creating forms of empowerment and education, and creating spaces where some of the structural violence can be addressed. So the News Divine, while it very much is a space that acknowledges the past, acknowledges the victims, why they were killed in this event, and also the many people who were injured, tries to acknowledge this and create a space for mourning for the families, but is also very firmly grounded in the idea of what is needed in the present. How can this space very directly addressed the fact that what caused this violence is that there are very few spaces for communities to gather in the area where the News Divine Club was. There are very few spaces for youth to engage in activities, including sports, cultural development, education, art. So there's a lack of infrastructure, a lack of support and opportunities for youth. And with the memorial as a backdrop, this space tries to remind us what are the consequences of this lack of spaces, this lack of recognition, the negative portrayal often of spaces where youth gather, right? And that's what creates some of their associations with organized crime, and then the difficulties of disentangling them when there aren't alternative spaces that are supported and fully appropriated by the whole of the community. So what News Divine does is create a space for dancing, for showing films, for the community to gather and share meals and create events that fully support what they need, and for youth to have, you know, their music acknowledged in these spaces, right? There was a lot of debate about reggaeton at the time when the News Divine, when this raid occurred, as a kind of an associations, negative associations between music, art, and some of the activities that the youth are involved in. And here the News Divine tries to change that narrative and say, let's create a space where we support all of that in collaboration with youth organizations in the area. And that's where the state comes in to give some resources. And we can talk a little bit later on about the challenges of these transformative spaces. I think we can come back to it in a little bit. And another example is the memorial for the disappeared in Baja California. That is a very different space. It's also in a community that's deeply neglected by the state. There is a lot of poverty there and lack of infrastructure, water, etc. And this is a space where victims were brought by the drug cartels to be, for their remains to be dissolved in acid and make it very difficult to identify them, and then buried on the ground. Families of the victims found this space and then led a struggle to for the government to do the forensic work of trying to identify some of the victims, but then converting the space into a memorial. And the process of creating the memorial in collaboration with activists and academics in the universities in the area has been a focus on, yes, we need a space for mourning. We need a space where people can gather and have even religious commemorations associated with the victims. But it also needs to be a space where we have a community kitchen, where we have art programming, where youth are painting the murals that decorate the space, where we have an open area where we show films and education. So that's the spirit in which they try to address the structural violence and convert a space to not just make it a place of mourning and memory in the traditional sense, but a space where some of the origins of that violence can be addressed.
My question is very much connected to what you have just said. To what extent these spaces are attracting what Cecilia Sosa calls extended communities of mourning, like not only the families of the relatives, not only the direct victims or the circle that is connected to the victim is the one that is appropriating this space, but also people that may have not experienced the firsthand violence, or that may not be aware of the situation that is happening in Mexico the way the victims are. To what extent these places have been successful in attracting different kinds of public into their causes and building these extensive networks of solidarity?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, I think it matters very much where these spaces are, that their geographical location and the type of activities, I think, shape very much how the spaces really fulfill this function and who participates in them. Because in many of these spaces, there is still a lot of violence around them, and in many instances, there is indifference, social indifference, or fear around engaging in some of these questions and participating in these spaces. But if we look at this from a wider perspective, there have been performative acts of memory in Mexico for many years, even before the war on drug cartels. You mentioned the femicides, for example, in Juarez, and that was, you know, the beginning of practices of occupying the streets with reminders, these pink crosses that were laid throughout the city to recognize the many victims of feminicides and make that as part of a call for justice and an organizing and creating awareness of what was happening. And there are many other collective actions that have taken place through the years. Maybe right now we're in a moment where, as never before, those collective actions are working together, even if they're in different locations. The networks of collaboration across activists are much wider and stronger than before. So they've gained force in this context of a prolonged war on drugs with such a significant number of victims that you know, don't have distinctions. They're widespread throughout the country. And there's a context of impunity and also no end in sight, despite the changes in government, as we said. So what some of these performative acts have been other examples of are taking the streets with, you know, mass protests, caravans led by the movement for peace with justice and dignity, or by the mothers of the migrants who have disappeared, intervening monuments and plazas with graffiti or other forms of intervention, renaming streets, as I mentioned, laying the anti-monuments, anti-monumentos, counter-monuments all along you know, highly visible avenues, or renaming the memorial in Polanco, not a memorial for the victims of violence, but a memorial for the victims of state violence. So really making these calls for justice and for responsibility by renaming and making big public performances of these actions. And so I think what they do is they try to change the narrative about who the victims are and to build solidarity from the ground up, which is something that is deeply missing in Mexico, because this narrative is so embedded of who the victims are. And that has created a lot of social indifference, right? If they deserved what happened to them, if they were also criminals, then how can there be solidarity around their deaths or their disappearance and the families that are looking for them? As I see it, I think this showing up on the streets every week to embroider, as a network of Embroidering for Peace does, to carry out these performances. There's also the group Huellas de la Memoria that brings out the shoes of families who are searching for the disappeared, with stories of how they, the many years and decades, in some cases, they've spent looking for their family members. They've been a way to put this conversation at the center of public debates in a different way, and also using artistic forms that can call in other members of the community into the conversation. And I think it has generated different conversations and different responses, but it has significant limitations. There is a lot of indifference, and I think people are very tired also of a context in which the violence has been so prolonged, and wanting to keep it outside of one's view, either because they disagree or because they are uncomfortable and can be seen, any involvement can be seen as threatening, in the sense that it might generate more violence. They can become a target, or there's also a sense that there is a constant reminder of the violence and people want to move on. So there have been many instances of rejection of these actions, and even from society itself, or even attacks and threats against some of the activists and some of these spaces, right, that directly threats from the drug cartels and attacks on the spaces themselves. So I think that makes it very challenging to carry out these practices of memory. It's another example of how practices of memory in a context of ongoing violence is extremely challenging and dangerous.
I want to finish our conversation. That has been really interesting, the kind of research that you're doing on a present time memory. And I was just thinking on what Svetlana Todorov described as exemplary memory. Todorov said that the exemplary memory was very much linked to this kind of political claim of guiding the future through remembrance. In this case, we're not speaking of guiding the future of Mexico, but the present, which is like the very interesting part of your research. How would you think about this exemplary memory by Todorov in this ongoing crisis through the kind of research that you're doing?
Thank you. I want to acknowledge also that this is work, all of this work, I've done it in collaboration with Benjamin Ninas, assistant professor of politics at Montclair University, who does more work on the theoretical aspects of the politics of memory. So my approach to Todorov's work has been through Ben, and that's how I've come to understand it. So Todorov's, from my understanding, Todorov's distinction between literal and exemplary memories aims to show a tension between memory that clings to a very specific event and its meaning for very specific victims, and memory that strives for generalizations, and how to strike that balance, right, of the need of a community to mourn a very specific situation, and the possibility of making a larger claim around the larger violence, the structural violence that caused it. So here, in Todorov's analysis, exemplary memories are meant to show a shared human condition and to create analogies between events in the context of, in a more universal context. And in our framing of politics of memory and the work that we've done around the idea of a politics of time, that is not just about the question of when and how to memorialize, but also the connections that are possible between past, present, and future. We're also very interested in these connections between the specific event and the larger questions of violence, and how some of the memory activists that we have looked at, like Comité 68's intervention in the State Memorial in Polanco or the News Divine Memorial, do not simply create analogies or show historical continuities, but have a focus on justice that goes further than the specific event, and try to seek memorial spaces that foster social remedies for specific local conditions of violence. Another scholar that I think does makes this connection in a very powerful way is Robin Wagner Pacifici, who argues that these types of interventions carry events forward. Rather than just compare them, they take them further into the future and not just in relation to the past. So one example, again, going back to the News Divine Memorial, is that there is an attempt to strike a balance between the commemoration of the specific individuals and a more general expression of the complexity of violence in everyday life, and try to avoid a space that's over-personalized at the expense of a wider historical context. So here, even though the architect and the designer of the space has really focused on this transformative memorial and trying to take it beyond what happened in that particular day, he has faced pushback from the victims and the victims' families, who are the ones supporting the space and who have asked for the space. So for them, as we were saying earlier, their interest in memory is mostly how it's going to help them keep the criminal case open, how it's going to help them make a claim for justice and reparations. And once the legal case ends, their connection to the space isn't as close or as alive as the idea of a transformative memorial might have put forward. So there's a real tension between this idea of giving a memorial a daily life and making it a space that can help us make these connections, these exemplary connections, right? That can be a space that is continually acting upon the present and shaping the future by allowing us to think about the past as something that informs how we act in the present and the kinds of violence that we want to avoid as we build towards the future. But in Mexico, this has been very difficult. It has seemed a bit distant and utopian still, and perhaps it's partly a result because there's institutions that are working on these questions are still quite immature. We also talked about the question of society and how society views this work of memory and how they view these institutions. They don't expect more from them than maybe a regular museum or monument space. And this is one reason why the memory that's oriented towards social transformation and toward making bigger claims, connecting it to struggles for justice, is still very challenging.
Alexandra, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be part of the Latin American Studies podcast at Villanova University. Do you have any upcoming project that you're looking forward?
Well, we're currently working on an edited volume with many authors in Mexico who are working on these questions of memory, memorial, forensics. It includes activists, scholars, art curators who are writing about these questions. And it's part of our effort to try to make this a larger debate and incorporate a lot of this work is in being documented and try to create spaces where we collaborate in putting forward a conversation, and that's not just within academia, but that involves multiple sectors that are involved in memory practices.
Well, we look forward to read that specific project that you're working on. Thank you very much and have a wonderful end of the semester.
Thank you so much for the opportunity and for these really thoughtful questions. It's my pleasure.